He is known in hushed tones as the Black Pope. He possesses no golden throne, wears no shimmering crown, and offers no grand benedictions to the adoring masses. And yet, there are many who would argue that his influence, his actual power, eclipses that of the officially recognized pontiff of the Vatican. Within the fortified walls of the world's most diminutive sovereign nation, there exists a clandestine structure of authority, one that has been meticulously shielded by millennia of tradition, inviolable oaths, and a profound, unnerving silence. In this place, decisions that possess the capacity to redirect the destiny of entire countries, or perhaps even reshape the trajectory of human history itself, are not proclaimed on television networks. They are murmured through echoing, ancient stone passageways. Have you ever allowed yourself to truly contemplate who holds the authentic reins of power within the Vatican? And why does the title Superior General inspire a greater sense of awe and even fear than the title of Pope? This narrative contains no hero illuminated by the spotlight, only indistinct figures moving deliberately behind a heavy curtain. For countless centuries, the world's gaze has been fixed upon the gleaming white throne of the Vatican, the hallowed seat of the Catholic Pope, who is regarded by millions upon millions as the mortal representative of God on earth. For the devout, he stands as a radiant beacon of spiritual illumination, the ultimate sentinel of truth and moral righteousness. But what very few are aware of is that merely a short distance from that venerated throne, concealed within a modest and unassuming building devoid of any crown or white papal robes, resides a power that many consider to be truly untouchable. This power is vested in the Superior General, the supreme commander of the Jesuit order, known formally as the Society of Jesus. For ages, he has remained a figure absent from the public stage, unlike the Pope. He bestows no blessings, presides over no magnificent masses, and delivers no Christmas sermons in the expanse of St. Peter's Square. Nevertheless, according to a trail of documents, persistent rumors, and even the faintest imprints in long-neglected historical archives, he may very well be the one who is truly orchestrating the movements of power from within the Vatican's sacred confines. It is certainly no mere accident that world leaders, seasoned generals, and even powerful cardinals speak of him using a name that is at once deeply reverent and profoundly chilling: the Black Pope. This designation does not simply arise from the austere black cassocks worn by the Jesuits, but from the immense, shadowy authority he commands in absolute, unbroken silence. It is a form of power that operates without any need for a spotlight, yet it is fully capable of molding the spiritual light that guides millions. His presence, or perhaps more accurately, his enigmatic absence from the world stage, has for centuries provoked a question that almost no one has the courage to ask aloud. Who genuinely wields the power inside the Vatican? And how has this minuscule nation, barely encompassing a square kilometer, succeeded in influencing wars, steering governments, and determining the fate of entire continents for so long? There is something about the official narrative that simply does not align. There are pages missing from the records, crucial documents that have vanished without a trace, and momentous decisions made with no indication of who authorized them. And in the periphery of every one of these unclear historical events, the Jesuits invariably appear, silent and unobtrusive, yet utterly impossible to ignore. So, is the Black Pope just another religious figurehead, or is he a central component of a hidden network of global power that the world has never been able to fully comprehend? Tonight, you are invited to step beyond that heavy, obscuring curtain, to trace the very origins of the formidable Jesuit order, and to uncover the concealed layers of nearly 500 years of secrets that were never shared with you in school. If the Vatican can be considered a spiritual kingdom, then the Jesuits are undeniably its elite special forces. This is not merely because of their formidable intellect or their ironclad discipline, but because of their chillingly unconditional devotion. The Society of Jesus was established in the year 1540, during the tumultuous and chaotic period of the Protestant Reformation. As revolutionary thinkers like Martin Luther began to challenge the very foundation of the Catholic Church's authority, the Vatican came to a stark realization. It required something far more potent than doctrine alone. It needed an organization that would wage its battles not with simple prayers, but with sophisticated strategy, with profound knowledge, and, when deemed necessary, with covert and clandestine action. The Jesuits were brought into existence by Ignatius of Loyola, a Spanish knight who was gravely wounded in battle. During the long and arduous months of his recovery, he did not set aside his sword. He merely substituted it with the Holy Scripture. And although he had left the physical battlefield behind him forever, he never relinquished the indomitable spirit of a warrior. And so, he constructed a religious order that was meticulously patterned after a military unit, complete with a strict hierarchy of ranks, a clear chain of command, unyielding discipline, and the demand for absolute, unquestioning obedience. Jesuit priests are not the tranquil, cloistered monks that most people envision. They do not sequester themselves away in monasteries. They venture out into the vast world. They achieve mastery of foreign languages, become experts in scientific fields, serve as counselors to kings, and erect vast educational networks that stretch from the heart of Europe to the farthest reaches of Asia. They are soldiers fighting on the battlefield of ideas. They are masterful persuaders, dedicated missionaries, and brilliant strategists. They enter foreign empires not bearing conventional weapons, but armed with something far more powerful: intellect and a total, unwavering dedication. The Jesuits swiftly ascended to become the strategic cerebellum of the Catholic Church. They founded hundreds of elite educational institutions across the globe, providing instruction not only to the faithful masses, but also to the children of the ruling elite. A great many of their pupils would eventually rise to become influential politicians, powerful generals, and, on occasion, formidable adversaries. Concealed beneath their simple black robes were minds that had been sharpened to the keenness of a razor's edge. But what elicited admiration also, inevitably, provoked fear. Their oath was not just a simple vow to God, but a specific and binding pledge to the Superior General, the one man who held singular authority over the entire Jesuit order, a power that some whispered even superseded that of the Pope himself. Once a man is sworn into the order, he ceases to be a mere individual. He becomes an integral part of a clandestine mechanism that operates silently and with a chilling, machine-like precision. Whispers soon began to circulate. The Jesuits were not merely engaged in preaching the gospel. They were engaged in espionage, in the toppling of regimes, and in the careful manipulation of global politics. Perhaps this is all just hyperbole. But if that is the case, why is it that over 80 different countries have expelled them at some point in their history? From France, Spain, and Portugal all the way to China, entire governments came to view them as a hidden, insidious threat. The Jesuits left no occupying armies in their wake, but they left behind a deep and lasting influence. They did not conquer territories of land. They conquered the territories of hearts and minds. They did not rule with the application of force. They ruled through the dissemination of ideas. And sometimes, ideas proved to be far more perilous than swords. At the very heart of this immense system stands the Superior General, quietly and patiently expanding his network, training his new soldiers, and commanding a vast empire that possesses no map and recognizes no borders, yet maintains a presence everywhere. It was then that the name Black Pope began to emerge, not in public orations, but in the private, guarded conversations between world leaders, in classified government documents, and in the course of investigations that never quite seemed to reach a final conclusion. In the majority of religious organizations, the leader serves as a symbol, not as the primary figure making strategic decisions. But within the Jesuit order, the Superior General is vastly more than a mere symbol. He wields genuine executive power, designed to be the central command of a global operating system. That is precisely why he is called the Black Pope. Not because he is in opposition to the White Pope, but because he exists within a parallel dimension of power, one that is hidden from view, unmonitored by any external body, and almost completely untouchable. The title of Superior General is not some modern fabrication born from the minds of conspiracy theorists. It is a real and officially recognized position within the structure of the Jesuits, and it has been in existence for nearly half a millennium. What makes historians so curious and world leaders so uneasy is the nearly absolute authority that this role commands. In contrast to cardinals or bishops, who are accountable to the Pope, the Superior General does not require the Vatican's approval to relocate personnel, to expand the order's influence, or to initiate what are referred to as special pastoral missions. In the internal documents of the Jesuits, his directives are to be regarded by his subordinates as the very voice of God. This represents a level of obedience so profound that many have compared it to that of a military general from the feudal ages. The building where he carries out his work, known as the Curia Generalizia, is situated in close proximity to the Vatican, yet it functions with complete independence from any papal oversight. It operates as a global strategic headquarters, receiving detailed reports from Jesuit branches established all over the world, analyzing shifting geopolitical conditions, and coordinating educational and missionary endeavors, as well as, according to some classified records, political influence operations in key nations. Even more astonishing is the fact that the Superior General is not elected by the public, nor does he require the recognition of Catholics worldwide. He is selected internally by a very small, exclusive circle of high-ranking Jesuit priests, individuals whose names and actions rarely, if ever, appear in the mainstream press. It is hardly surprising, then, that people have begun to ask, is this a democratic structure existing within a religion, or is it a closed and secretive power system where crucial decisions are perpetually made by a hidden few? Some historians have referred to the Superior General as the ghost advisor to the Pope because a significant number of popes throughout history were either Jesuits themselves or were profoundly influenced by Jesuit institutions. While one man stands on the balcony of St. Peter's to bless the assembled crowd, another sits in the Curia Generalizia, meticulously reviewing intelligence reports from Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and methodically planning the next global maneuver. It is a machine, precise, efficient, and utterly invisible. The true scope of that power is incredibly difficult to trace. There is no map of its influence, no official figures on its membership, no publicly available budget, but a collection of scattered clues throughout history all point to a single conclusion. The Superior General does not simply manage the Jesuit order. He coordinates a global network of influence. From elite universities and sprawling charitable foundations to closed-door summits where global policies are forged, the shadow of the Jesuits, and standing behind it, the Black Pope, is never very far away. And that is precisely what makes people so uneasy. The greatest power is not the power that you can see. It is the power that you never see, but that still controls everything. Not long after their inception, the Jesuits began to do something that few religious orders in history had ever dared to even conceive of. They infiltrated the very core of secular power in Europe, not with armies and weapons, but with intellect and influence. While other monastic orders chose to retreat into quiet and peaceful contemplation, the Jesuits marched boldly into royal courts, into esteemed academic halls, and into the secret chambers where the decisions that would shape the lives of millions were being made. They had no need for thrones of their own because they had mastered the subtle art of influencing those who already occupied them. The 16th and 17th centuries were a tumultuous age of religious wars and blood-soaked alliances forged between the Church and the ruling feudal dynasties. In the midst of that chaos, the Jesuits emerged as the unofficial advisors, the spiritual guides, and the royal confessors, always possessing the uncanny ability to know exactly what to say and when to say it. In France, Jesuit priests not only provided instruction in the royal academies, but they also became the spiritual mentors to prominent members of the Bourbon family, one of the most powerful and influential dynasties on the entire continent. They understood how to convert prayers into effective instruments of governance and how to translate the language of Scripture into the nuanced language of diplomacy. In Spain and Portugal, where royal authority was inextricably linked with the Catholic faith, the Jesuits became the spiritual architects of their vast overseas empires. While Spanish galleons set sail in their quest for gold, Jesuit missionaries were quietly spreading the faith across the New World, sometimes leading the way for the conquistadors, sometimes following the troops, but always being the last to depart. In Austria, Poland, and even as far as Russia, the Jesuits were much more than mere missionaries. They trained the next generation of rulers, princes, dukes, and even pagan nobility in the disciplines of philosophy, politics, and theology. They shaped the minds of these future leaders before they ever ascended to the throne, planting the seeds of Jesuit thought where it would matter the most, at the very roots of power. And when they were unable to speak directly with the kings, they discovered another path. They became trusted royal advisors, personal confessors, or private tutors to the heirs apparent. They had no need to be kings themselves. They simply needed to sit beside those who were destined to become one. That proximity alone was enough to generate significant concern within royal circles. Whispers began to circulate. When a king speaks, you may in fact be hearing the echo of a Jesuit's voice from behind the curtain. With their immense network of schools, churches, and training centers, the Jesuits did not just create an elite system of education. They cultivated an entire generation of thinkers who were loyal to their specific worldview. Children who were raised under Jesuit guidance grew up to become bishops, generals, and government ministers, men who entered the world of power with their minds already seeded with ideas that had been planted long ago. This extraordinary rise to prominence was no accident. It was a deliberate, step-by-step process because the Jesuits understood a fundamental truth. If you wish to change the world, you must start at the source of its ideas. And ideas that are planted at the right moment can travel much farther than any law or any army. Over time, this quiet yet pervasive presence became a significant thorn in the side of many European governments. Some kings chose to ban them, and some courts expelled them, but they always managed to return because the seeds they had planted in the minds of the youth had already taken firm root. And so, when the question arose of who was truly controlling the great game of Europe, the answer was not always to be found on the throne, but often in the library, where a Jesuit sat silently, a book in his hand, saying nothing, while his ideas echoed in the secret councils of kings. In the annals of history, few religious organizations have ever been expelled from more than 80 countries and territories, and yet not only survived, but returned even stronger, as if completely untouched. The Jesuits are the notable exception, and that very exception has led many historians to ask a crucial question. Were they simply a missionary order, or were they a hidden network of influence so powerful that entire empires were compelled to confront it? The 18th century marked the zenith of this suspicion across Europe. Royal courts began to sense the presence of something beyond their control, seeping into the realms of politics, education, and even the military. There were no armed uprisings, no pitched battles, only this steady, disciplined, and nearly irremovable presence. In the year 1759, King Joseph I of Portugal, acting under the guidance of his powerful prime minister, Sebastião de Pombal, issued an order for the expulsion of all Jesuit priests. This was not because they were preaching heresy, nor was it due to any religious conflict. It was because they had become far too skilled at shaping education, and through that, shaping the minds of the young nobility. Those who had been educated by the Jesuits no longer offered blind obedience to the crown. They questioned authority. They thought independently, and on certain occasions, they placed their faith above the law of the king. In 1764, it was France's turn to act. Under the reign of King Louis XV, the Jesuits were formally accused of operating beyond their religious mandate and were systematically removed from every position of influence within the state. Their schools were shuttered, and their assets were seized. Strangely, no specific crime was ever officially articulated. The reasons given were intentionally vague, as if the monarchy was afraid of something it could not precisely name, but knew was undeniably real. Spain, Naples, Parma, and ultimately, even the Vatican itself followed suit. In 1773, under immense and unrelenting pressure from the major European powers, Pope Clement XIV issued the Decree Dominus Ac Redemptor, which officially disbanded the Society of Jesus worldwide. It was intended to be their final end, but that is where the strangest part of the story truly begins. There are no rebellions, no acts of violence, no organized retaliation. The Jesuits simply vanished, as if they had foreseen this eventuality all along. In many countries, they offered no resistance. They simply changed their robes, moved their operations underground, and continued their work of teaching, writing, and training new generations under different names. Their vast libraries, filled with strategic knowledge, were not burned. Some were hidden away by noble families who understood that while the Jesuits could be banned, the ideas they had planted would outlast any royal decree. And then, less than 4 decades later, in 1814, the Jesuits were fully and formally restored by Pope Pius VII. This was not because their past actions had been forgiven, but because the Vatican had come to realize something of critical importance. In an age of rising secularism and widespread anti-clerical movements, no one could defend the faith more effectively than the Jesuits. The real question is, how could an organization that had been condemned across an entire continent not only survive, but return even stronger? Was there some hidden force that was protecting them? Or had they constructed a system so deeply embedded within the intellectual class, the ruling elite, and international networks that had become immune to the fluctuations of surface-level politics? Their mass expulsion did not weaken them. It only made them harder to trace. No longer tethered to fixed monasteries, they became mobile, adaptable, and perpetually ready for any political shift. An empire with no physical borders, held together only by loyalty and intellect. And at the head of that invisible empire, the Black Pope continued to issue his commands in silence, unbound by Vatican law and unaffected by national borders. He remains the only leader in the history of the Catholic Church to command a global network that was once banned but was never truly broken. There is something peculiar about the currents of history. The most mysterious and powerful forces rarely engage in open conflict. They move in silence, like 2 subterranean rivers flowing beneath a city that has never been mapped. The Jesuits and Freemasonry represent 2 such currents. One is cloaked in the language of religious devotion, the other in the mystique of ancient esoteric knowledge. Both have shaped the landscape of secular power in profound and lasting ways. And yet, it has never been entirely clear whether they are mortal enemies or merely reflections of the same underlying force. On the surface, the Vatican has long and vehemently condemned Freemasonry, branding it as heretical, atheistic, and morally relativistic. Several papal decrees have explicitly forbidden Catholics from joining its ranks, calling it a betrayal of the faith. In turn, Freemasonry, which is grounded in the principles of reason, science, and humanism, has often criticized the Church as being outdated, oppressive, and fundamentally hostile to the concept of free thought. But a deeper and more perplexing paradox lingers. Both of these groups operate in secrecy. Both are highly structured and hierarchical. Both have a global reach. And both are frequently found circling the epicenters of political, financial, and military power. This significant overlap gives rise to a series of unsettling questions. Are they truly rivals, or are they simply 2 distinct branches of the same invisible hand? Some historians, and more than a few old and persistent conspiracies, have suggested a murky and complex relationship between the Jesuits and the Freemasons, particularly during the late 18th and early 19th centuries, a period when monarchies began to crumble, revolutions erupted across continents, and the map of global power was being fundamentally redrawn. There are whispers that exiled Jesuits, cast out during the period of their suppression, quietly infiltrated Masonic lodges, bringing with them their insider knowledge and their unparalleled organizational precision, exactly what Freemasonry needed to expand its influence across Europe and the New World. Both organizations share a number of eerily similar characteristics: secret initiation rituals, hierarchical structures, the use of coded language, and above all, an oath of unwavering and absolute loyalty to the Brotherhood. These parallels are too precise and too numerous to be simply dismissed as mere coincidence. One scholar once astutely observed, if the Jesuits were born in the light of faith, Freemasonry was born in the light of reason, but both of them understood that real power never shines in the open. One of the most intriguing hotspots for this interaction was post-revolutionary France. As churches were being destroyed and the clergy either fled or capitulated, the Jesuits reappeared quietly within intellectual circles, many of which were heavily influenced by Masonic ideology. There is indirect but compelling evidence to suggest that Jesuit priests acted as advisors within certain secret societies that were tied to Freemasonry, particularly in projects related to educational and social reform. While it has never been publicly acknowledged, the overlap in both personnel and philosophy in these gray zones has long been a puzzle for historians. No official document has ever confirmed any kind of alliance. The Vatican vehemently denies it, and Freemasonry remains characteristically silent. But in the field of historical research, a coordinated silence from both sides is often far louder than any accusation. It is also crucial to remember that Freemasonry is not a single, monolithic entity. It is a vast and intricate web of local lodges, each with varying degrees of religious and political influence. In England and America, it has often leaned towards humanism and the values of the Enlightenment. In continental Europe, especially in France and Italy, it has delved deeply into the world of politics, at times acting directly against the influence of the Church. And yet, in those very same places, the Jesuits never completely vanished. Sometimes they appeared as guardians of the faith, and at other times as silent observers in the background. Then comes the most audacious theory of all, that neither the Jesuits nor the Freemasons are enemies, or even true allies, but rather two arms of a much higher control system. A system that utilizes both faith and reason, not in conflict with one another, but in tandem to shape the world. A system in which the Black Pope is not the supreme commander, but merely a single link in a far greater chain, one that history has never quite found the words or the courage to name. When speaking of the religious history of Europe, there are few words that send a deeper and more profound chill down the spine than heresy, and standing behind that fear was a powerful and relentless machine. The Inquisition, a time when faith was no longer a source of salvation, but a blade held menacingly over the necks of those who dared to think differently. Yet, behind the scenes of these brutal and terrifying trials, few people noticed a figure who never stood before the public, but who quietly shaped the direction of it all: the Superior General of the Jesuits, the Black Pope. The Inquisition had been in existence since the 12th century, but by the 16th century, it entered a new and terrifying era of ruthless precision, a development that coincided with the dramatic and meteoric rise of the Jesuit order. The Vatican did not just need faith to combat the rising tide of the Protestant Reformation. It needed something sharper, a more effective tool to control thought and to extinguish any spark of rebellion before it could ever ignite. And the Jesuits were the perfect force for this task. They possessed the intellect required to detect dangerous new ideas, the educational reach necessary to reshape popular beliefs, and most importantly, a surveillance network that spanned the entire Catholic world. They had no need for soldiers or for bloodshed. They simply sent discreet reports to their headquarters, where the Superior General would read them and issue his orders. Not every Jesuit actively participated in the interrogations or the trials. That was not their primary role. Their power lay in something far deeper: direction. They were the ones who authored the manuals that meticulously defined the fine line between orthodoxy and heresy. They designed the intellectual filters that were used in schools, where even a student's innocent question could be interpreted as evidence of spiritual rebellion. And they, or more precisely, their superior general, controlled the flow of thought at its very source. There was no need for physical prisons. He controlled minds through a system of internal memos and subtle, coded directives that were distributed across Europe like a remote censorship system. It functioned so effectively that even those who were never formally accused of heresy lived in fear of thinking differently. Some historians have written, "Your thoughts weren't killed by torture. They were killed by deliberate and suffocating silence." The Jesuits understood this principle perfectly. They did not need to interrogate people. They simply created an environment where people policed themselves. In that climate of fear, deviant ideas did not need to be punished. They simply disappeared, not because they ceased to exist, but because no one dared to speak them aloud. Some historical records suggest that a significant number of Inquisition cases were initiated based on Jesuit reports, submitted after lectures or private theological discussions, where something that was said behind closed doors was later encoded and sent back to their headquarters. There, the Superior General would make the determination as to whether a larger investigation was warranted. This was no longer preaching. This was a form of mental manipulation carried out through intellect. It was not about defending the faith, but about redefining it through a system of invisible control. The Inquisition was the public tool, but the long-term strategies, the mental frameworks, and the silent detection of spiritual dissent all bore the unmistakable fingerprint of Jesuit thinking. And when such a system operates as smoothly and silently as a well-oiled machine, the one who is orchestrating it from the shadows becomes far more dangerous than any judge presiding in a courtroom. The Superior General never needed to set foot inside a tribunal. A single, subtle nod from him could activate an entire network of fiercely loyal priests who would ensure that any dangerous thought disappeared long before it ever had the chance to grow. The Vatican, barely occupying 44 hectares of land, an area smaller than a standard golf course, remains a place where world leaders make silent pilgrimages, where intelligence agencies tread with extreme caution, and where billions of believers look with a mixture of reverence and unease. In a world that is driven by oil, finance, and military might, the Vatican exists as a profound paradox. It possesses no vast army, no independent central bank, and no significant natural resources. And yet, it exerts a level of global political influence in ways that very few people can truly comprehend. Behind those ancient and silent stone walls, the official pope is not always the one pulling every single string. Researchers, politicians, and even former members of secret orders have all hinted at this reality. There is a strategic brain operating behind the scenes of the Vatican, a center of command that functions with a colder and more calculating logic than faith alone can provide. And more often than not, that figure is the Superior General of the Jesuits, the so-called Black Pope. Unlike the Pope, who is required to appear before the crowds, address the press, and deliver public speeches, the Black Pope remains perpetually hidden from view. He coordinates a vast and sophisticated global network of universities, research centers, charitable organizations, and international advisory boards, all operating under the banner of education, but quietly gathering intelligence, shaping influence, and forging crucial ties with the world's political elite. The Jesuits operate in over 110 countries. They have no need for official embassies because every one of their chapels, every one of their schools, every Jesuit university serves as a cultural outpost, a place where they can teach and quietly establish connections with a local power structure. From South American presidents to Asian prime ministers, a great many world leaders were once educated within Jesuit systems. And whether it is by design or by mere chance, they often carry with them the philosophy, the discipline, and the loyalty to the order that shaped their formative years. In the realm of modern politics, ideological loyalty can often prove to be more enduring than any military alliance. A single policy, a particular worldview, the quiet belief If it is planted in childhood, it can last far longer than any formal treaty. The Jesuits are well aware of this fact. They do not just teach people how to read. They train the very people who will one day write the rules. The Vatican has no surveillance satellites, yet information flows to it constantly. The Jesuits have no publicly acknowledged intelligence agency, but in every classroom, in every charity, in every chapel, there are those who know when to listen, when to observe, and more importantly, who to report to. They do not need to break any laws. They simply need to be in the right room with the right person at the right time. And so, in those quiet, closed-door meetings where global strategies are forged without any public fanfare, the name of the Superior General may never be spoken, but his influence is undoubtedly there, in the reports, in the data, and in the caution with which others speak. One researcher once astutely remarked, "The Vatican is the only country that doesn't need to declare its power, because every other center of power already knows what it holds, and within that silent machinery, the Black Pope never needs to step into the light. He only needs to ensure that every link in the chain functions perfectly, from a schoolboy in Manila to a researcher in Boston to a priest in Buenos Aires. When it is needed, he does not issue commands. He simply shifts the direction of thought. In a world where missiles mean less than information and ideology outweighs brute force, the Vatican, with its quiet, intricate system built by the Jesuits, has become a true superpower of influence. It needs no borders, yet it shapes nations from within. And that is why, in the back rooms of global summits, you will often hear a whispered question: who's sitting with the Vatican? And who's listening from behind the curtain, dressed in black? The history of the Vatican is cloaked in a sacred, holy light, but it is also shadowed by a quiet and pervasive darkness, where death does not always arrive as a result of illness, and the sudden passing of a pope can plunge the entire world into a profound and suspicious silence. On the 28th of September, 1978, a mere 33 days after he had ascended to the papal throne, Pope John Paul I was discovered dead, quietly resting in his private chamber inside the Vatican. There had been no sound, no warning, and no prior indications of any serious illness. He departed from this world with a silence so deep and so absolute that it immediately became suspicious. That silence ignited a firestorm of questions that continue to echo decades later. John Paul I was no ordinary figure. He was widely known for his reformist vision, his genuine closeness to the faithful, and his clear and unwavering intention to purge the Vatican of its ever-growing political and financial entanglements. But that very resolve, according to a multitude of theories, made him a significant threat to those who held deep and entrenched power. Among them, some have speculated, was a radical and conservative faction within the Jesuit order. In the days immediately preceding his death, John Paul I was reportedly in the process of preparing a complete and thorough restructuring of the Vatican's financial apparatus, with a particular focus on targeting the Vatican Bank, which had long been rumored to be involved in money laundering, massive fraud, and to have ties to the Italian mafia. He also had plans to remove several high-ranking cardinals, some of whom were allegedly connected to clandestine secret societies like Propaganda Do, P2, a shadowy Masonic lodge that had successfully infiltrated the spheres of banking, politics, and even the church itself. The problem was that many of the key figures within these networks had either direct or indirect connections to the Jesuits. No one ever named the Superior General directly, but a series of independent investigations conducted by journalists, historians, and even former intelligence agents all pointed in the same general direction. There's a hand inside the Vatican, a hand that is never seen on camera, but that is coordinating everything from the shadows. On the night before his death, John Paul I is said to have summoned a few of his most trusted aides to discuss a list of personnel transfers and removals that he intended to announce. That list has never been made public. By the next morning, he was found lifeless, a book resting open on his chest, his glasses still perched on his face. The official cause of death was listed as a heart attack. There was no autopsy performed, no independent investigation conducted, and no detailed medical report was ever released. The entire matter was officially closed as being God's will. But for those who were familiar with the inner workings of the Vatican, that deafening silence rang much louder than any funeral bell. Years later, books like David Yallop's In God's Name and Richard Hammer's The Vatican Connection attempted to lift the veil of secrecy. Although they were unable to provide definitive legal proof, they both came to the same conclusion. Powerful and unseen forces had decided that John Paul I could not be allowed to continue. And among the list of suspects, the Jesuits, with their global network, their iron discipline, and their subtle ability to influence internal church dynamics, were consistently mentioned. There were no direct accusations, but no one was willing to rule them out. So the question remains, could someone possess enough power to bring down a pope? And if so, would they need to act alone? Or could they simply press a button and allow the silent machine to do the rest? In the deep shadows of the Vatican, the truth never stands in the light. It is only ever glimpsed in missing files, in vanishing traces, in the questions that no one dares to ask aloud. In any organization, the oath serves as its foundation. It is the sacred thread that binds an individual to the mission, to the cause, to something that is held to be higher than life itself. But within the Jesuit order, the oath is not merely a ritual. It is a total and binding contract, a complete transformation of the individual into an instrument of absolute and unquestioning obedience. The Jesuits are renowned for having one of the most rigorous and demanding training processes in the entire Catholic world. Becoming a Jesuit is not simply a matter of studying theology or practicing religious rites. It is a journey that spans many years, a grueling series of tests that are at once physical, intellectual, and spiritual. But at the very culmination of that arduous journey comes a single ceremony, the final oath. And it is that oath that sets the Jesuits apart from any other religious order. In that sacred vow, a Jesuit swears absolute and total loyalty, not just to the Pope, but specifically to the Superior General of the Jesuits. This is not loyalty in a symbolic sense, but in its most literal and uncompromising form. His commands are to be treated as the very voice of God. Personal opinions, emotions, and even doubts must be completely erased in order to achieve the mental state of being fully prepared for any mission, anywhere in the world, at any given time. There is a passage, long debated but frequently cited by scholars, from the higher-level Jesuit oath. I commit that I will have no will but that of the order, that I will go wherever I am commanded, do whatever is required, even if it means entering cursed lands, infiltrating the enemy, or destroying the Church's enemies by any means necessary. While the Vatican has never officially confirmed the authenticity of this dramatic text, internal training documents provide a number of indirect clues. Manuals that outline in detail how to erase one's personal will, how to see the world not through your own eyes, but through the specific lens of the order. One core principle is repeated over and over again. Perind ac cadaver, which translates to as a corpse, meaning to obey your superiors as a lifeless body would, motionless and without resistance before another's will. There is to be no resistance, no questioning, and no personal interpretation. It is this specific mindset that allows the Jesuits to function as a cohesive unit globally across a multitude of cultures, languages, and governments. A Jesuit operating in the Congo can act in perfect harmony with a Jesuit in Canada because both have been programmed with the exact same system of thought, and both are bound to a single master, the Black Pope. And this is not just a matter of theory. In real life, these vows have been translated into decisive action, such as entering active war zones, going undercover in hostile organizations, or executing silent missions that have never appeared in any official news bulletin. Some have said that the Jesuits have no need for prisons to hold people. They hold them with their oaths. These are oaths that are not just enforced by doctrine, but through a comprehensive internal surveillance system where each member is taught to constantly monitor himself and to report himself if he should ever stray from the designated path. In such a highly structured system, the Superior General has no need for punishment. He only needs to give a glance, or to send a quiet message, to prompt thousands of individuals around the world to adjust themselves like gears rotating in perfect and silent synchrony. This level of discipline does not just create organizational strength. It creates a form of irreversible power. Each individual becomes a loyal signal tower, feeding a global network that serves a single purpose and a single commander. And throughout the course of history, any organization that commands such an extraordinary level of loyalty, regardless of what it is called, is not merely a religion. It is a system, a strategy, and a tool in a much larger game than any sermon could ever possibly describe. When the sails of Spanish and Portuguese ships cut across the vast oceans in the 16th century, the world was ushered into a new era, the age of colonial empires. But in every one of these expeditions, alongside the soldiers, merchants, and explorers, there was always at least one figure dressed in a black robe, holding a crucifix, and carrying sacred hymns instead of weapons. He was a Jesuit priest, and he was tasked with a mission that was considered no less important than the acquisition of gold, the conquest of souls. The Jesuits did not arrive in the New World with the intention of seizing land through the application of force. They came to gain spiritual control through the power of faith. In untouched territories, among forest-dwelling tribes, or in remote highland communities, they constructed missions, churches, and schools, and they slowly but surely reorganized indigenous life in accordance with Catholic doctrine. In the regions of Paraguay, Brazil, and Argentina, they established self-contained and self-sufficient communities known as reductions, where the native people lived entirely separate from the colonial society, under the total and absolute authority of the Jesuit priests. On paper, these were presented as peaceful sanctuaries, devoid of private property and violence, and filled with music, prayer, and education, a Catholic paradise established deep within the jungle. But the question remains, a paradise for whom? While the colonial empires were busy looting gold and enslaving bodies, the Jesuits claimed that they had come to protect the dignity and the souls of the indigenous populations. But they too came to manage vast resources, including land, agriculture, livestock, and they even controlled the trade in valuable commodities like salt and exotic timber. Some historians have described the reductions as functioning like miniature theocracies, self-sufficient, tightly governed, and structured almost like an empire within an empire. Not all of the indigenous people converted to Catholicism willingly. Many were pressured into conversion through a form of soft assimilation. Those who did not convert could not be saved, could not gain access to education, and were subsequently excluded from the God-protected communities. It was a subtle but powerful mental chain, far more effective than any physical rope. The people were not bound by force, but by a system of beliefs that had been carefully reshaped at their very roots. To the Vatican, the success of the Jesuits in the New World was seen as a great triumph. They had not only succeeded in spreading the faith, but they had also built a model society, which was presented as proof that religion could lay the foundation for an entire civilization. But to the colonial powers, this model slowly but surely became a significant threat. The native communities that were under Jesuit protection grew progressively wealthier and more independent. And worst of all, they pledged their primary loyalty to the Jesuits, not to the distant king. In the year 1767, King Carlos III of Spain, who had become alarmed by the growing influence of the Jesuits in South America, ordered their immediate expulsion from all Spanish colonies. Hundreds of missions were subsequently abandoned. The indigenous people, who had lived for generations under what they saw as the Jesuits' fatherly rule, were now forcibly absorbed into the imperial systems by military force. An entire social order collapsed, but the seeds of Jesuit influence had already been firmly planted. Before their departure, the Jesuits meticulously copied everything: documents, maps, records, and internal reports, and they smuggled them all back to Europe. At that time, the Superior General in Rome is believed to have issued silent orders to archive the entire knowledge base of the New World missions, and some of those documents have never been released to the public. This reveals something much deeper. The Jesuits were not only messengers of the faith, they were also the keepers of secrets about an entire continent. Secrets about indigenous cultures, about hidden riches, about geography, and perhaps most importantly, about how to control the human mind. And those secrets, stored away quietly for centuries, may still be shaping their strategies today, strategies that the world has never been told about. While Europe was still deeply intoxicated by the gold and silver fever that had swept out of the Americas, the Jesuits had already set their sights much farther afield, towards a land that held no precious metals in its soil, but possessed something that they desired even more: an ancient civilization, closed off, intensely proud, and seemingly immune to the power of faith alone. That land was Asia. Unlike the newly discovered territories of the Americas, the great civilizations of China and Japan were no strangers to power. They had their own emperors, their own long-standing dynasties, their own complex writing systems, and their own sophisticated philosophies. They could not be swayed by the simple presentation of the Bible because they already possessed their own sacred texts. And so, the Jesuits chose to employ a different strategy. They would not enter these lands brandishing crosses, but with telescopes, with advanced calendars, and with a wealth of scientific knowledge. The first Jesuit to successfully reach China was Matteo Ricci, who arrived in the late 16th century. He did not attempt to preach in the bustling marketplaces while wearing the robes of a priest. Instead, he learned to speak fluent Mandarin, dressed himself in the manner of a Confucian scholar, and began to introduce the concepts of Western science, astronomy, mathematics, and cartography. He did not ask the Chinese to simply believe in God. He asked them to respect the inherent logic of the heavens. And once he had earned their admiration and respect, he began to introduce the tenets of his faith through the medium of philosophy. This innovative approach, which came to be known as cultural adaptation, became the very foundation of the Jesuits' campaign across the continent of Asia. They did not directly confront the native cultures. They infiltrated them quietly, strategically targeting scholars, government ministers, and even members of the royal courts. In China, the Jesuits played a major role in assisting the Ming court with the reform of its astronomical calendar, with the accurate prediction of solar eclipses, and with the proper alignment of imperial rituals with celestial movements. In a society where the sky was seen as a symbol of the divine mandate to rule, this work granted them real and tangible power. For a period of time, Jesuit priests became trusted, unofficial advisors, charged with overseeing the imperial observatories. In Japan, the path they had to tread was much harsher. Early Jesuits, such as Francis Xavier, found a considerable degree of success, converting tens of thousands of people, particularly in the region of Kyushu. But once the ruling shoguns realized that this new faith had the potential to divide loyalties and that it carried with it the influence of European powers, the Tokugawa regime responded with brutal and unrelenting suppression. Christianity was officially banned, and a period of intense persecution began. But the Jesuits did not disappear. They simply went underground. Some of them lived in hiding for decades, training new believers in absolute silence, and many of them even died as martyrs without ever revealing the names of their fellow priests. Their unwavering and steadfast devotion earned them a title among the Japanese believers, the invisible warriors of faith. Despite the brutal crackdown, Jesuit thought left an indelible mark on Japan. Concepts such as a monotheistic God, eternal salvation, and Western moral philosophy began to slowly seep into the Japanese intellectual class, planting the seeds that would go on to shape the country's cultural reforms centuries later. In China, the Jesuits also left behind a profound and lasting legacy in the fields of cartography, medicine, mathematics, and astronomy. But more importantly than the science they introduced, they left an ideological footprint, a quiet and enduring presence in the realm of cultural decision-making. Even under the subsequent Qing dynasty, when Christianity was once again suppressed, Jesuit writings were still being secretly copied, studied, and circulated within elite scholarly circles. More importantly, the The Superior General of the Jesuits, from his office in Europe, always knew exactly what was happening in the East. Detailed reports, maps, political charts, and social analyses were all encoded and sent back to Rome. In many cases, he possessed a better understanding of the inner workings of the Asian courts than most Western kings. There was no war, no conquest, no military occupation. And yet, the Jesuits succeeded in inserting themselves into the very mental architecture of two of the world's oldest and most formidable civilizations. And that tells us something profound. Their mission was not just to convert souls, it was to shape how a civilization thinks about itself. If the long and complex history of religion were to be imagined as a grand stage, then some of its most ferocious and consequential battles never actually took place in the open. They did not unfold on bloody battlefields, nor did their echoes reverberate through the ringing of church bells. They took place in the cold, stone corridors of the Vatican, where prayers often gave way to memos, to discreet councils, and to decisions that were made in absolute silence, decisions that could shift the very fate of the Church itself. Since its founding in the year 1540, the Jesuit order, the Society of Jesus, has always stood apart from the rest. They were not monks who were in pursuit of solitude or a life of pure asceticism. They were meticulously trained to be strategists, educators, missionaries, and, at times, influential political advisors. This remarkable flexibility, combined with their global reach, soon made them the targets of deep suspicion, not from outsiders, but from within the Church itself, particularly among the clergy, a powerful bloc of traditionalists. Those who held tightly to the established hierarchy and to doctrinal stability began to view the Jesuits as being too adaptable, too clever, and far too difficult to control. The tension first began to surface in their innovative missionary approach. While other religious orders clung rigidly to established rituals and dogma, the Jesuits willingly embraced local cultures. They dressed as Confucian scholars in China. They used native terminology to explain complex Christian theological concepts, and they skillfully merged local traditions into Catholic rites. To the conservatives within the Vatican, this was not adaptation. It was a betrayal. They accused the Jesuits of enabling heresy, of watering down the divine truth, and of using the faith as a mere tool to gain influence. But the real conflict was never solely about theology. It was about power. As the Jesuits continued to expand their influence across the world, educating elites, influencing politics, and shaping the minds of future leaders, a palpable fear began to grow within the Vatican that the Superior General was quietly and methodically building a parallel Vatican. It was not one that was publicly declared, but it was one that was very real nonetheless. Some popes were openly and vocally uncomfortable with this situation. Pope Clement XIV, the one who ultimately issued the decree to suppress the Jesuits in 1773, was said to have been under immense pressure from the conservative factions within the Curia, men who simply could not accept the existence of a religious order that wielded more autonomy than most archbishops. At one point, whispers even began to circulate that the Jesuits had the ability to sway papal elections through their carefully cultivated relationships within the College of Cardinals, or by mentoring key figures long before they ever rose to positions of power. No concrete proof was ever brought forward, but the questions never went away. The Jesuits, for their part, did not confront these accusations head-on. They simply kept working. They kept training. They kept planting their seeds. Their belief was simple, that any opposition would eventually fade, but that their ideas would endure far longer than any accusation. Still, the friction never truly disappeared. Behind the closed doors of the Vatican, intense and often heated debates unfolded between the traditionalist bloc and the Jesuit camp. They clashed over a range of sensitive issues, including liturgical reform, the role of lay people within the Church, and the question of how deeply the Church should engage in modern politics. In the end, no side ever achieved a true victory. But in battles of this nature, the side that is more patient, more strategic, and more extensively networked usually holds the real power. For many decades, the Superior General of the Jesuits played the long game. He did not make appearances at major ceremonies, but his influence could be found in Catholic universities, in think tanks, in policy institutes, and in nearly every place where the Vatican could not afford to lose ground. Inside the Church, the Jesuits have never been fully and warmly welcomed, but they have never been completely cast out either, because the truth of the matter is that they are what the Vatican cannot publicly embrace, and yet what it cannot possibly live without. When World War I and World War II erupted, the world spiraled into a maelstrom of fire and steel, of bombs, of hatred, and of the catastrophic collapse of empires. Superpowers clashed, governments fell, and tens of millions of people perished. But amidst all the gunfire and chaos, there was one particular force that commanded no army, fought in no battles, and never appeared on any military map, yet still managed to retain its influence, its access to information, and a secure foothold on both sides of every conflict. That force was the Jesuits. No official document has ever stated that the Society of Jesus directly participated in any war operations. And yet, their pervasive presence across Europe, the Americas, and Asia, within both Allied and Axis territories, has led many to believe that they quietly acted as channels of communication and as brokers of subtle influence, especially during critical moments of transition. Before and during the First World War, Jesuit priests operated schools, philosophy institutes, and missions across Germany, France, Austria-Hungary, Italy, and even Russia. They held no rifles in their hands, but they taught the children of generals, politicians, and aristocrats. A significant number of high-ranking officers on all sides of the conflict had once sat in a Jesuit classroom. The Vatican's official policy of neutrality allowed the Jesuits to move about freely, to send messages, and to maintain quiet lines of contact at a time when ordinary channels of communication were being heavily censored, intercepted, or completely destroyed. Post-war records suggest that Jesuits may have served as informal envoys, carrying messages between rival powers and even advising certain heads of state, always from the deep shadows. But it was the Second World War that placed the Jesuits in the most ambiguous and revealing spotlight. While the Vatican maintained a famously cautious and controversial silence in the face of Nazi Germany's rise to power, many Jesuit priests in Germany developed a complicated and often contradictory relationship with Hitler's regime. Some of them actively resisted, and some helped Jews to escape, but others were reportedly used to spread anti-communist messages under the justification of protecting Christian Europe from the Bolshevik tide in the East. In Austria and Poland, a great many Jesuit clergy were imprisoned, tortured, or killed. And yet, some others were left completely untouched and were allowed to continue managing their religious facilities or teaching under direct Nazi supervision. That glaring inconsistency raised a number of questions. Was there a dual strategy being quietly coordinated from within the Vatican? After the war, as the Cold War began to crystallize, the Jesuits emerged once again, not weakened, but strategically repositioned. Reports suggest that Jesuit networks were tapped by the Allied powers, particularly in Latin America, Eastern Europe, and Asia, where the threat of communism loomed large. The post-war Superior General never made any public appearances, but he was widely believed to have had regular contact with the CIA, with Vatican intelligence, and with various Catholic-aligned political movements in Europe. The specific contents of those exchanges remain a closely guarded secret, but the results speak for themselves. The Jesuits not only survived the devastation of the war intact, but they actually expanded their global reach. Empires collapsed, borders were redrawn, and a new world order emerged from the ashes. But the Jesuits remained completely unscathed, unprosecuted, and unexposed. And that leaves us with a quiet but persistent question. Were they one of the very few groups who were able to see the entire chessboard and simply place their pieces wisely on both sides? In the blood-stained shadow of the 20th century, those who managed to survive without wielding conventional weapons were not merely lucky. They were the ones who understood the nature of power best. And in the long and storied history of the Catholic Church, No one has understood power better than the Society of Jesus. The world wars concluded amidst scenes of flames, rubble, and profound moral wounds that had no historical precedent. Empires had crumbled, millions of people were displaced, and faith in the old order of things had been completely shattered. As nations scrambled to rebuild their infrastructure and to reassert their political authority, there was one organization that did not need to recover because it had never truly fallen. It had simply stepped back to observe. And when the world began to usher in a new era, the Jesuits returned quietly, like a phoenix rising from the ashes. The post-war 20th century was an age of Cold War, of rampant consumerism, and of rapid globalization. But it was also a time when power no longer emanated from the control of land or guns, but from the control of knowledge, of ideas, and of educational systems. And in that particular domain, the Jesuits were undisputed masters. In less than 3 decades, the Society of Jesus completely restructured its global network. They reopened and modernized their schools, universities, and research centers across the Americas, Europe, Asia, and Africa. They no longer focused solely on theology. Their curriculum now included the social sciences, political thought, modern philosophy, and even technology. Catholic values were no longer preached through the medium of Scripture alone. They were quietly and skillfully embedded in the concepts of humanism, critical thinking, sustainability, and global ethics. Gone were the days of the lone missionary trekking through distant jungles. In their place now stood humble-looking professors speaking at international conferences, policy advisors working in development agencies, and brilliant strategists with Jesuit-educated minds occupying positions in government offices and academic think tanks. They did not wear priestly robes, but they thought like Jesuits, loyal to a philosophy that transcended national borders and political parties. It was during this transformative period that the role of the Superior General also evolved. He was no longer just a spiritual leader. He became the global strategist of the order's influence. A constant stream of reports flowed in from hundreds of Jesuit centers worldwide, which were then analyzed, synthesized, and used to forecast political, social, and cultural trends. There was no need for espionage and no need for armaments. Information was power, and the Jesuits understood this fundamental truth better than anyone else. In the 1960s and 70s, as the world reeled from a series of crises of belief, the Vietnam War, widespread social revolutions, the spread of Marxist ideologies, the Jesuits did not resist. They entered directly into the chaos. Many of the most prominent social activists, radical thinkers, and even revolutionaries of that era had once sat in a Jesuit classroom. And this was not a contradiction, it was a strategy. Because the Jesuits knew that in order to shape the new world, you could not stand outside of the disorder. You had to step into it and guide it from within. It was during these turbulent decades that people began to say that the Jesuits were no longer missionaries. They were a global strategic institution. And perhaps that assessment was not wrong. From the meeting rooms of the United Nations to the headquarters of major NGOs, from Ivy League universities to the governments of post-colonial nations, Jesuit alumni were everywhere. They were not wearing cassocks, but they carried with them a structured way of thinking that had been shaped in classrooms long ago: serve, adapt, but never abandon the mission. And then, a moment of profound and quiet symbolism arrived. In the year 2013, for the very first time in the long history of the Catholic Church, a Jesuit was elected Pope. Pope Francis, a former Jesuit priest, a man who had been shaped by the poverty and injustice he had witnessed in the barrios of South America. To the world, his rise to the papacy was seen as a sign of renewal. But for those who had studied the history of the Jesuits for 5 centuries, it was the final, triumphant crescendo of a long and patient plan. The student was now seated upon the white throne, and in the shadows, the Black Pope still remained. He did not seek any applause. He did not appear before the crowds in St. Peter's Square. But across all the continents, he quietly continued to coordinate a vast and intricate network, where seemingly unconnected individuals still moved in unison towards a shared vision of faith, strategy, and unwavering service. As the world stepped into the post-World War II era, the map of global power was being redrawn, not only through diplomatic summits, but also through the deep shadows of intelligence networks. In the thick and murky fog of the Cold War, where every superpower had its own ideology, its own set of tools, and its own objectives, a series of unlikely alliances and unspoken partnerships began to emerge. Partnerships that no one would ever publicly admit to, yet which were unmistakably present in every strategic decision made behind the scenes. Among the many controversial names of the 20th century, the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States, and the Jesuits, a Catholic religious order sworn to uphold faith and justice, are two names that few people would ever expect to find side by side. One organization operated with absolute secrecy, toppling governments, coordinating covert wars, and collecting global intelligence. The other was a religious order composed of educators, priests, and missionaries who claimed to be serving God and the truth. And yet, this very contrast created a strange kind of synergy, one that is not easily explained by logic alone. Because both of these organizations shared a unique and valuable trait: a global network, deep and unparalleled access to local communities, and the ability to penetrate a society at its most fundamental level. After the Second World War, as America came to the realization that nuclear weapons could never be used to win hearts and minds, the CIA began to seek out subtler and more effective channels of influence. And on this quiet and invisible battlefield, the Jesuits, with their hundreds of schools, universities, churches, and NGOs spread across the entire world, became an ideal, if unofficial, partner. No official documents directly link the two organizations, but countless testimonies, declassified files, and the recollections of former agents and clergy members all suggest that this informal alignment began in the 1950s, particularly in geopolitical hotspots like Latin America, Southeast Asia, and parts of Africa. In South America, where Marxist revolutions were erupting across the continent, many Jesuit priests were leading community education programs. But they were also reported to be providing valuable intelligence on political shifts, public sentiment, and the activities of revolutionary groups. According to several reports, the CIA secretly collaborated with members of the Jesuit clergy to collect social data, to analyze political trends, and even to coordinate anti-communist messaging through their network of schools and churches. In Vietnam, during the war against the French and later against the Americans, Jesuit missions quietly became hubs of information exchange. With their deep and established roots in the local communities, Jesuit priests and Catholic laypeople were able to gather critical intelligence from areas that were completely inaccessible to any foreign operative. They were trusted precisely because they were seen as men of faith, and that trust gave them a level of access that even well-funded intelligence agencies could not achieve. In Africa, where the Cold War turned into a frantic race for influence between the United States and the Soviet Union, the Jesuits launched a series of modern missions that were focused on health, education, and humanitarian work. And yet, some former American operatives later admitted that the reports coming from Jesuit centers were often more reliable and more neutral than the ones coming from the U.S. embassies themselves. And there is another intriguing detail. Many senior CIA officials were educated in Jesuit-run institutions, most notably at Georgetown University, one of the most influential Jesuit universities in the United States. Both institutions claimed to be serving the community, opposing tyranny, and defending freedom. But the interpretation of that freedom, it seems, varied and ran very deep. So, were the CIA and the Jesuits truly allies? Or were they just two powerful forces that happened to be moving in the same direction for different reasons? There is no simple answer to that question. But from a purely strategic perspective, they shared one profound and overarching goal: the control of the human mind. One of them wielded espionage, technology, and data. The other used sermons, education, and belief. But the ultimate objective remained the same: to shape the world according to a vision that they each believed was right. And in a world where battles are no longer fought with bombs, but with information, with perception, and with thought, those who are able to influence how we think, how we feel, and how we act are the ones who truly hold the power. If the CIA can be considered the master of information, then the global financial elite are the masters of money. And in today's world, there is no power that is more enduring than the one that controls both minds and money. That is why a question that was once dismissed as a mere conspiracy theory is now being taken much more seriously. Could the Jesuits, with their global network and their centuries of accumulated influence, be aligned with, or even be guiding, some of the world's wealthiest families and corporations? The Jesuits have long been known for their formidable intellect and their brilliant strategic thinking. As early as the 16th century, they understood one essential truth. A religious order cannot possibly survive on faith alone. It must be financially strong, independent, and resilient. That is why they were one of the very first religious groups to invest heavily in land, in education, and especially in banking. From their mission centers in Latin America to their universities in Europe and North America, the Jesuits quietly built a vast and intricate web of assets, which are often protected under the status of nonprofit organizations, yet are deeply and intricately connected to major corporations, to central banks, and to private investment funds. Independent researchers have pointed out that many of the founders or senior advisors at some of the most powerful European banks were either former Jesuit priests or were directly trained at Jesuit academies. Names like Rothschild, Morgan, and even certain discrete Swiss banking institutions have had consultants and thought leaders with backgrounds that are firmly rooted in Jesuit education. In the United States, schools like Georgetown, Fordham, and Boston College are much more than just religious universities. They are the breeding grounds for future political figures, for high-powered financial lawyers, and for global economic advisors. Many of their most prominent alumni have gone on to become hedge fund executives, central bank officials, or even finance ministers. But the real alliance lies not just in the realm of education. It lies in a shared philosophy. The Jesuits do not simply teach people how to succeed. They teach them to serve a greater cause, and they value order, stability, and the exertion of a moral influence on society. For the global elites, who are constantly seeking a humanitarian face to protect their immense wealth and to avoid public backlash, Jesuit ideology offers the perfect silent partnership. That is why in many countries, large-scale development projects that are funded by major banks are often overseen or advised by Jesuit-run institutions or their charitable arms. This form of cooperation creates a new kind of soft power, where finance and faith can operate together under the benevolent banner of goodwill. There are global charities that are building schools, feeding the poor, and delivering aid, but standing behind them are banking entities that have been accused of market manipulation, of money laundering, or of destabilizing the economies of developing nations. So, who is it that connects these two disparate worlds? Often, the answer is former Jesuit priests or individuals who have been deeply shaped by the Jesuit systems of ideological training. The Superior General, the man often referred to as the Black Pope, has never made an appearance at a global financial summit. And yet, through a network of think tanks, advisory boards, and the Jesuits' tightly woven international network, he likely knows exactly where the money is flowing, who is pulling the strings, and where to place influence for maximum social effect. This is no longer just religion. It is a coordinated global structure of power, where each financial decision can set off a chain reaction in the realms of education, politics, and even spiritual life. And in that high-stakes game, the Jesuits may not be the ones who are moving the pieces in plain sight, but they're the ones who are shaping the board itself. The elite may control the markets, and the intelligence agencies may control the flow of information. But in order to truly steer the course of an entire civilization, you need more than just money or data. You need a place where the world's true decision-makers can gather together in absolute silence, far away from the prying eyes of cameras, untouched by the processes of democracy, and completely immune to the pressures of public opinion. They call them secret conferences. It is not an uncommon phenomenon in modern history. Major global events, from financial crashes to presidential elections, from the collapse of regimes to sudden and unexpected shifts in national foreign policy, have often followed in the wake of private meetings for which there are no official records and no public statements. And yet, someone always seems to know what transpired, and certain shadowy figures are seen in attendance again and again. The Jesuits are often among those whose names are whispered in suspicion. They leave no public trace of their presence, but the quiet attendance of Jesuit members, or of those who have been trained in their institutions at Bilderberg meetings at the World Economic Forum in Davos, or inside the advisory boards of the Vatican, has been noted by keen observers. They do not wear clerical collars, and they do not claim to be representing religion, but they carry with them a specific way of thinking, a particular method of action, and most importantly, a loyalty that is not pledged to nations or to political parties, but to a deeper and much older order. Many researchers have asked the question, why do so many key figures in global strategy councils, from the IMF to NATO, share a Jesuit educational background? Is it simply because they are all brilliant individuals, or is it because they were specifically chosen? And if that is the case, who is doing the choosing? One of the biggest mysteries of all revolves around the unofficial meetings that take place between religious leaders and the centers of financial power. According to a few insiders, these clandestine gatherings do not involve discussions of theology or faith. They talk about things like how to maintain social order during times of crisis, how to humanely control media narratives, and how to preserve public trust as governments around the world continue to lose their credibility. And in these highly sensitive conversations, Jesuit scholars often play a key and influential role. They do not command, they guide. They lead the discussions with the logic of harmony, of ethics, and of stability. But is it really just for their intellect? There is a quieter and more unsettling theory, one that few people dare to say aloud, that the Jesuits, or perhaps the Superior General himself, are not merely guests at these exclusive gatherings. They may, in fact, be coordinating them, not directly, but through a vast network of think tanks, NGOs, deep research institutions, and strategically placed former insiders within global foundations. There are no contracts signed, no signatures on any documents, but everything moves with a kind of choreographed precision. Some of these meetings are said to take place in ancient monasteries hidden away in the Swiss Alps. Others are held at quiet universities in Austria, France, or Italy, where the guests are only told the general theme of the meeting, while the true facilitator remains completely unseen. And after each of these meetings, no official announcements are made, but the world somehow seems to shift. Who is it that sits in the shadows? Who remains silent while the world outside shouts? Who never speaks, and yet is heard by all? If you have ever heard the phrase, silence isn't ignorance, it's decision-making, then you may begin to understand why the Jesuits never need to stand in the spotlight to influence even the brightest of places. When a story becomes too big, too deep, and too real, the most effective way to make the public stop believing it is to turn it into entertainment. It is a simple yet incredibly powerful strategy, one that modern media and the film industry have mastered over the course of many decades. And when it comes to mysterious power structures like the Jesuits, the Black Pope, or the shadowy networks that operate behind the scenes of the Vatican, Hollywood and the global mainstream media have never been mere bystanders. Think back for a moment. How many times have you seen hooded monks dressed in black robes, wandering through ancient monasteries, whispering Latin prayers, taking part in secret rituals, or even orchestrating assassinations, fighting over holy relics, and pulling the strings behind religious power struggles? From the Da Vinci Code to angels and demons, from Vatican Secrets documentaries to fictional dramas that hint at a dark and corrupt church, the Jesuits and other Catholic secret orders have become recurring motifs in popular culture. But here is the paradox. The more they appear on the screen, the more the real-life questions surrounding them get dismissed as mere fantasy. This phenomenon is known as the discredit through fiction effect, a communication technique that has been widely noted by sociologists and psychologists. When a particular truth is too disturbing for the public to face, you simply let them laugh at it or enjoy it as a form of entertainment. And soon enough, they will stop looking any deeper. So who designed this strategy? And who benefits from turning religious mysteries, questions of power, conspiracies, and organizations like the Jesuits into simple movie plots? Here is something to think about. Many of the directors, screenwriters, and producers of major Vatican-themed films were educated at Jesuit universities or had close academic ties to them. Schools like Georgetown, Loyola Marymount, and Boston College not only teach theology, but they also have top-tier media and film programs, and they even provide funding for religious film projects. It is surely no coincidence that many of the so-called anti-Vatican movies never actually cross the line. They may be shocking, but they always seem to end with a message of peace, or they bury the real core of the story under multiple layers of supernatural fiction, romance, or wild and unbelievable conspiracies. And while the public is busy debating whether the Pope is hiding the Holy Grail or if Jesus left behind a secret bloodline, the real and far more serious questions get pushed into the fog of imagination. Questions about the power structure of the Jesuits, about the role of the Superior General in global decisions, or about the Vatican's extensive financial alliances. Even in the age of the Internet, where information spreads at the speed of light, topics that involve the Jesuits or the Black Pope rarely manage to break through the hidden filters. Deep, thoughtful content is consistently pushed down by the algorithms. Channels that speak too clearly about these subjects often get flagged, shadow banned, or quietly removed. And original historical documents are frequently taken out of context, stripping them of their credibility. Has the mainstream media become the perfect smokescreen? It is not designed to hide the truth, but to blur it, to distort it, and ultimately to make us forget about it. Is there a hand or a system that is carefully shaping the media in order to distract the world from asking the right questions? And if that is indeed the case, then the screen is no longer a mirror that reflects reality. It is a velvet curtain that conceals a backstage area where the true decision-makers never step into the spotlight. In every dynasty, the throne has always been the ultimate symbol of supreme power. At the Vatican, that throne is white, representing a sacred presence, pure and divine, and symbolizing the all-encompassing authority of the faith. To billions of people around the world, the Pope is the undisputed head of the Catholic world, the keeper of canon law, and the voice of God on earth. But how many of them ever stop to ask themselves, is he truly the one who is in ultimate control? Behind every pope stands a tightly woven and complex structure of cardinals, bishops, archbishops, monks, and theological scholars. But deeper still, behind closed doors, within confidential councils, and in the realm of off-the-record decisions, there lies a force that is rarely named but is always present. That force is the Superior General of the Jesuits, or as many astute observers coldly refer to him, the Black Pope. Unlike the official Pope, who is elected by the College of Cardinals and is welcomed with thunderous applause in St. Peter's Square, the Black Pope requires no public praise. He does not step out on balconies to address the crowds, and he delivers no public blessings. And yet, his power seeps quietly and pervasively into every single layer of the Vatican's operations, from education and academic advising to media influence and global strategy. Those who have worked within the inner sanctums of the Vatican have described the Superior General as the mind behind the curtain. He does not pull the strings in plain sight. He simply places the first stone, and then the chain reactions that follow seem to unfold naturally, as if they were following a script that had already been written long ago. Look at the recent history of the papacy. There have been popes who have resigned, most notably Pope Benedict XVI, who stepped down quietly amidst a flurry of scandals, immense pressures, and unspoken forces. Who was it that advised him? Who crafted the invisible weight that ultimately led to his retreat? No one says it out loud, but in the background of that momentous event, the name of the Jesuits quietly surfaced in countless expert analyses. Then came a definitive turning point. For the very first time in the Vatican's long and storied history, a Jesuit was elected to the papacy, Pope Francis. It was a moment that seemed ordinary to most, but if it is examined closely, it marked the first time that the white throne was claimed by a man who came from the most secretive and powerful order on earth. Was this a mere coincidence, or was it the final act of a long and patient campaign of influence? Was it the moment when the Jesuits no longer just whispered from the wings, but stepped directly onto the center of the stage? When a script is written by the director, it should come as no surprise when the lead actor begins to look a lot like him. The Superior General remains unseen by the public, but his people, his philosophy, and his carefully cultivated network now hold some of the highest and most influential posts in the Church, from young cardinals who were educated at Jesuit institutions to academic councils, legal advisors, and media strategists. So, when the Pope reads his message from a balcony, as the entire world listens in 50 different languages, who is it that wrote the first draft? That is a question that may never be publicly answered. But the more we observe how the Vatican operates, with such discipline, such secrecy, and such near-perfect efficiency, the more we begin to realize that the light of the white throne may actually emanate from somewhere far darker, far deeper, and infinitely quieter. Not all power needs to be seen in order to exist. The most dangerous kind of power is the kind that never shows its face. And in the hallowed halls of the Vatican, where faith and strategy speak in ancient tongues, the one who is truly calling the shots is never the one who is standing in front of the camera. South America, a land of fiery spirit, where the mighty Andes stand tall against the tangled expanse of the Amazon, and where the blood of ancient civilizations still lingers beneath the feet of the statue of Christ the Redeemer. But it is also a continent that, throughout the course of the 20th century, was rocked again and again by military coups, by brutal dictatorships, and by intense ideological clashes between communism and capitalism. Global observers have often been quick to blame the CIA, Mossad, or various Western economic interests for meddling in the politics of countries like Argentina, Chile, Brazil, and Bolivia. But there is one organization that is rarely, if ever, named, yet whose footprints can be found everywhere: the Jesuits. As early as the 17th century, the Jesuits had already reached the farthest corners of Paraguay, Peru, and Brazil, where they established their reductions, isolated religious settlements. These were not just simple missionary outposts. They were experimental socio-political models, where the indigenous people were brought under a system of control, all in the name of saving their souls. And when the colonial empires finally collapsed and the South American nations gained their independence, the Jesuits did not retreat. They simply shifted their roles. They became advisors, educators, and, at times, peacemakers during periods of political crisis. But from these positions of influence, they also shaped the minds of those who would one day rise to take power. In the 20th century, as the United States and the Soviet Union turned South America into a Cold War chessboard, many Jesuit priests openly supported liberation movements, the ideals of Christian socialism, and the cause of social equality. They became the spiritual allies to a number of resistance groups, from the Sandinistas in Nicaragua to the FARC in Colombia. But here is the paradox. The Jesuits did not simply choose sides. They chose to be in a certain position. While some Jesuit priests were standing shoulder to shoulder with peasant fighters in the jungles, others were lecturing at elite military academies that were attended by the children of military leaders and top politicians. This made many people wonder, were the Jesuits truly neutral, or were they strategically positioned everywhere at once? In 1973, when President Salvador Allende, the world's first democratically elected Marxist leader, was overthrown in a bloody coup in Chile, many scholars noted that religious advisors were present on both sides of the conflict. Jesuit priests had stood with Allende during his political campaign, and yet former Jesuit students were sitting inside the command centers of the coup. Likewise, in Argentina during the Dirty War, when tens of thousands of people were kidnapped or disappeared, some priests were murdered for speaking out against the regime, while others remained calmly and conspicuously silent. And in the prisons of that era, confessions that were made to Jesuit clergy were sometimes used to quietly probe for information about political dissidents. How could the Jesuits possibly survive under both oppressive right-wing regimes and revolutionary left-wing uprisings? The answer to that question lies in their enduring strategy of education, influence, and silence. They did not carry weapons themselves. They trained those who would. They did not write the policies. They taught the people who would. In the shadows of every military coup, some of them prayed, and some of them watched in silence. But the Jesuits always stayed, still teaching, still writing, opening new training centers, and even authoring the biographies of some of history's most central figures. Because for them, power does not reside in the bullet or in the ballot box. It resides in the mind. And ideas, once they have been planted in the right place at the right time, will eventually bloom, even under the harshest of dictatorships, and even in the midst of violent revolutions. Every dictator has a beginning. Not everyone is born with a throne already waiting beneath their feet, a rifle in their hand, or a presidential seat reserved for them. Some of them rise from the depths of poverty, while others climb their way up through the ranks of elite military academies. But here is the strange and unsettling part. A significant number of them spent their formative years under the roof of a Jesuit education. It may sound like a contradiction. How could a Catholic order that is built on the principles of service, humility, and education also become the breeding ground for authoritarian minds that are known for their oppression and control? The answer to that question lies in the Jesuit philosophy of education, which emphasizes discipline, logic, critical thinking, rhetoric, and the art of strategic influence. In Jesuit schools, students are not just taught theology or classical literature. They're trained to view society as a system, one that can be understood, shaped, and ultimately controlled. Take, for instance, perhaps the most famous example, Fidel Castro, the revolutionary leader of Cuba, who studied at the Colegio de Belén, a prestigious Jesuit school in Havana. It was there that he not only sharpened his formidable intellect, but also learned the power of tight organization, how to wield words like weapons, and the profound and intoxicating pull of idealism. One of the priests who taught him once remarked that he was not just smart. He knew that he wanted to change the world. And Castro was not alone. Rafael Trujillo of the Dominican Republic, Alfredo Stroessner of Paraguay, and François Duvalier of Haiti all passed through institutions that were operated by the Jesuits. Strangely enough, many of them maintained quiet and discreet ties with their spiritual advisors even after they had seized power. The deeper you look into this phenomenon, the clearer it becomes. Dictators are not born as monsters. They're taught how to read a crowd, how to master the principles of public psychology, and how to craft powerful symbols of authority. And those particular tools, whether intentionally or not, were often sharpened in Jesuit classrooms, with 500 years of tradition standing behind them. This does not necessarily mean that the Jesuits intentionally set out to create tyrants, but they do equip minds with a powerful set of tools. Some people use those tools to serve humanity, while others use them to rule over it. Because every noble ideal, once it falls into the wrong hands, becomes vulnerable to manipulation. Imagine this for a moment. In a quiet classroom, a 14-year-old student learns how to use language to persuade others. Years later, that same boy stands before a crowd of tens of thousands, raising a rifle in the air and declaring the establishment of a new regime. But the power that he wields is not just brute force. It is language, it is structure, and is a mindset that was carefully forged by Jesuit hands. And in many cases, when these strong men have faced an internal crisis or an outside threat, they have returned to where it all began, to the priests who once taught them, seeking spiritual counsel or quiet advice from the old networks that they still trust. No one could definitively say that the Jesuits intended to produce dictators, but the sheer number of authoritarian leaders who once walked through their halls raises a serious question. Were the seeds of their future actions planted long ago, in silence, in discipline, and in a quiet awe of power, without anyone even noticing? World War II ended with powerful images of Allied victory and of Nazi Germany being crushed into ruins. But those who truly understand the deeper currents of history know this. Many of the most notorious war criminals never actually faced trial. Adolf Eichmann, Joseph Mengele, Klaus Barbie. Those names did not die in the rubble of Berlin. They simply disappeared. And their disappearance was not a mere stroke of luck. It was made possible by a sophisticated and highly organized escape network that was backed by organizations that no one would ever suspect. Monasteries, dioceses, and most notably, a secret religious corridor that stretched all the way from Europe to South America. Its unofficial name was the Ratlins. These were covert escape routes, often beginning in Austria, Italy, or Spain, that moved through a series of religious way stations and led directly to safe havens in Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, or Syria. The operators of these networks did not wear military uniforms. They wore clerical robes. In declassified documents, the Vatican, and particularly certain monastic branches in Italy and Austria, was suspected of having helped to provide fake documents, Red Cross passports, and even theological justifications for mass murderers who were fleeing from Europe. Notably, some members of the Jesuit order were accused of having offered safe haven to high-ranking SS officers, Gestapo agents, and German scientists before they were quietly absorbed into larger networks, such as America's Operation Paperclip. Operation Paperclip, which was orchestrated by the CIA and its forerunners, was a top-secret mission to bring hundreds of German scientists, many of whom had faithfully served the Nazi regime, into the United States to work on military and space programs. The U.S. government did not want these valuable minds falling into Soviet hands. But in order to make them disappear from the Nazi records, they needed a reliable laundering system. And the Vatican, with its unique ability to issue humanitarian certificates and refugee passports, and with its vast network of monasteries stretching across Europe, became the perfect link in the chain. Many monasteries served as temporary shelters, protected by the principle of religious immunity. Some former Nazis, quietly aided by priests or monks, had their identities changed, were converted to Catholicism on paper, and were then put on ships that were bound for the New World. A pressing question remains: did the Jesuits, with their global network, their secretive operations, and their deep and established presence in the Austria-Italy-Spain corridor, play a role in this operation? No official documents have ever been released that publicly confirm it, but a great many witnesses, researchers, and independent historians have noted a distinct pattern. Wherever secret flows of human beings were moving, specially trained members of the clergy were often nearby. In South America, where hundreds of former Nazi officers found a new paradise, they were not welcomed by underground agents. They were welcomed by local Catholic communities, sometimes under the direct guidance of priests who had been trained in Europe. Could all of this have been a mere coincidence? One chilling theory emerges from this complex picture. In the eyes of some members of the clergy, even a mass murderer could be saved if they possessed some form of strategic value. If they could help in the fight against communism or provide valuable intelligence, then helping them to escape from justice was quietly seen as serving a higher purpose. But here lies the core ethical issue. Who gets to decide what purpose is high enough? Who decided that Joseph Mengele deserved to vanish into safety, while the millions of people he had killed did not even get a name? Maybe no one who is alive today can answer that question. But one thing is clear: the silence of the Vatican, and especially of powerful and secretive orders like the Jesuits, was the very reason that this network was able to survive and thrive for so many decades. Because once crimes can be hidden behind the walls of a cathedral, and once conscience is redefined by strategy, then even the darkest of killers can be blessed if they know the way. When we think of modern war zones, from the burning sands of the Middle East and the blood-soaked lands of Africa to the fractured nations of Eastern Europe, we often picture international aid agencies, UN peacekeeping forces, or frontline journalists. But if you look more closely at the humanitarian reports, the medical logs, and the relief record from these areas, there's one name that quietly appears more often than you would expect: the Jesuits. How did a religious order that was founded nearly 500 years ago with the mission of converting the heathens end up being so deeply embedded in the heart of modern conflict zones? Are they there to save souls, or are they there to gather intelligence? Are they bringing faith, or are they shaping the post-war realities? From Iraq and Syria to the Congo and Venezuela, from Afghanistan to Myanmar, Jesuit-affiliated groups like the Jesuit Refugee Service, JRS, are always present. They set up schools and refugee camps, they distribute medicine, and they teach children who have lost their parents to war. That image is noble, it is human, and it is true, but it is only part of the truth. Behind these humanitarian missions, there is an extremely disciplined and well-organized network that is capable of deeply embedding itself within local communities, of understanding complex cultures, of mastering native languages, and of operating on a long-term basis without drawing any undue attention to itself. It is surely no coincidence that many intelligence agencies have referred to Jesuit priests as the soft eyes and ears of the West in active war zones, where information is heavily distorted, where the media is censored, and where governments are fragmented. Jesuit priests and brothers often become trusted sources of intelligence for multiple sides, not just for the Vatican, but also for foreign embassies, for NGOs, and even for national intelligence services. Perhaps they do not intend to spy, but when an organization is providing medical care, teaching children, and interacting on a daily basis with orphans, with elders, with militia members, and with disaffected soldiers, the amount of localized insight that they are able to gather often surpasses that of any military unit. And when information becomes as valuable as gold during wartime, those who hold it can quietly steer the outcome. Take Syria, for instance, where the Jesuits remained on the ground, even in besieged areas like Aleppo and Homs. While most international organizations had pulled out, some Jesuit groups stayed, offering medical care while simultaneously observing the humanitarian conditions. And soon enough, their detailed reports, funneled through the Vatican, found their way onto the desks of European leaders. In the Congo, the site of one of the world's worst humanitarian disasters, the Jesuits did more than just open schools. They actively engaged in reconciliation dialogues between the warring factions. Once again, they acted as mediators, but as mediators with their own distinct philosophy, their own curriculum, and, at times, their own political orientation, which they used to guide the youth that they were educating. As the world undergoes a new phase of geopolitical realignment, with a growing backlash against direct military intervention, so-called soft forces like the Jesuits are becoming more vital than ever before. They carry no conventional weapons, and yet they wield an enormous amount of influence over the social and ideological aftermath of any conflict. This leads us to a difficult but necessary question. Are they simply driven by their Christian ideals? Or are they spiritual engineers who are quietly rebuilding nations from the ashes? Perhaps the answer lies in the Jesuits' original 16th century strategy: to infiltrate through education, to dominate through ideology, and to transform without the use of force. In an era where bombs no longer win wars, figures like them, dressed in simple black robes, smiling gently, and armed with brilliant strategic minds, may very well be the new form of power in postmodern warfare. In a world that is spiraling through rapid technological change, a new kind of Cold War, and a deepening crisis of trust, few people notice that the Jesuits are still here, not being loud, not being flashy, but never having gone away. And at the very center of this vast and quiet network stands one man, quietly overseeing the activities of nearly 16,000 Jesuits in 112 countries around the world. He is not on television, he does not post on social media, and outside of a few inner circles, very few people truly know what he thinks. His name is Arturo Sosa Abascal, a Venezuelan priest who was born in Caracas in 1948 and who holds a doctorate in political science. He once taught at Georgetown University. He served as the rector of a Catholic university, and most notably, he was elected in 2016 as the 31st Superior General of the Society of Jesus. In this role, he is the direct successor to Ignatius of Loyola, the man who founded the Jesuits back in the 16th century. They call him the Black Pope, not because of the color of his skin, but because of the immense power that he holds, a power that moves in the shadows, a power that is not codified in any papal decrees, but that resides in his authority to deploy, to direct, to shape, and sometimes to intervene. What makes Arturo Sosa so exceptional is not just his impressive academic background. It is his nuanced and almost elusive political philosophy. While most religious leaders tend to steer clear of the complexities of geopolitics, he speaks openly and articulately on subjects such as capitalism, social injustice, climate change, migration, and the complex and often fraught relationship between faith and power. Many analysts believe that he is not just a spiritual leader. He is an architect who is working behind the scenes, quietly rebuilding the Vatican's role in the emerging new global order. He is a priest who is fluent in theology, who is well-versed in Marxist philosophy, and who is a former participant in international research councils on politics, economics, and sustainable development. Fluent in Spanish, Italian, and English, and conversant in French, he does not need to speak very often. A few closed-door meetings, a few internal memos, and the strategic education of youth through the global network of Jesuit universities. That is enough to shift the balance of social influence. Picture this: CEOs, scholars, and politicians spread across the Americas, Europe, and Asia. But many of them were once students in Jesuit institutions. They were shaped by a philosophy of spiritual discernment, but they were also trained in the principles of service, leadership, and social strategy through the Jesuit curriculum. So, ask yourself this question: who truly shapes the future, if not those who taught them how to think from the very beginning? And that is the true power of a Black Pope. He does not need to be in the spotlight. He only needs to keep the system alive, operating quietly, effectively, and constantly reproducing its global influence through the channels of education, humanitarian work, philosophy, and politics. You may have never heard him speak. You may have never seen his face in the media. But if you have noticed the recent shifts in global education, in how we define the concept of justice, or in the way that young leaders are being formed, then believe this: behind those changes, there's a man in a black robe who is redrawing the world's map with his intellect and his unshakable loyalty to the Society of Jesus. And so, the 21st century, no matter how technological, how AI-driven, or how globalized it may become, still cannot erase the far-reaching influence of an organization that has stayed hidden in plain sight for nearly 500 years. And the one who is leading it today is none other than Arturo Sosa, the Black Pope of our time. As the world entered the 21st century, many people believed that the era of political religion had finally come to an end. The Crusades, popes who commanded military power, and bloody holy wars all seemed like relics of a distant and unenlightened past. In the modern view, religion was expected to step aside to make room for the ascendancy of science, democracy, and the free market. But history rarely moves in straight lines, and in the deep shadows of our current global crises, climate change, proxy wars, mass migration, widespread poverty, and social injustice, religion is quietly making a comeback, not in the form of pure faith, but as a refined and sophisticated form of political power. The Vatican, with its uninterrupted 2,000-year vision, seemed to sense this return long before anyone else did. And within the Vatican, the Jesuits, with their unique gift for strategic discernment and social maneuvering, have become the active arm of this comeback. They're not using guns, they're not using laws, but they're using ideological influence, they're using education, and they're using the technique of weaving religious philosophy into the fabric of public policy. This new face of religious power became clearest in Latin America, where Jesuit priests are no longer just preaching sermons, but are now actively engaging in land reform, advocating for the rights of indigenous peoples, and even entering into dialogue with leftist political movements. Religion is no longer standing outside of the political arena. It is back as an old player that is now wearing a new face, one that is intellectual, humanitarian, and highly strategic. In Africa, Jesuit-founded schools are shaping a new generation of leaders who are being trained to become responsible global citizens. It is a beautiful phrase, but beneath it lies a deeply Catholic sociological lens, one that shapes how these future leaders will view the world, the nature of power, and the concept of justice. In Asia, particularly in the Philippines, South Korea, and even in Vietnam, humanitarian organizations and social media platforms that are rooted in Jesuit networks are quietly steering the direction of political discourse. They do not spread overt propaganda, but they do shape values. And even in the West, where Catholicism was once seen as being outdated, religion is being rediscovered, not for its ancient rituals, but for the spiritual grounding that it offers in a fractured and disoriented postmodern world. Young people are returning to churches, not out of a sense of nostalgia, but because they are seeking something solid and dependable in an age of moral relativism and identity crisis. Today's political religion no longer resembles the medieval model. There are no popes who are wearing golden crowns. It is far subtler, and perhaps for that reason, more dangerous because it does not need to seize power directly. It only needs to influence those who already have it. And in that particular game, the Jesuits once again stand at the crossroads of ideals and authority. With their global network, their timeless intellect, and their unique ability to permeate every single level of society, they have no need for flags or for armies. They only need the minds of young people who believe that they are changing the world for the better, without ever realizing who it is that defines what better actually means. Political religion has not returned through the grand gates. It has slipped back in quietly through classrooms, through conferences, through social media platforms, through climate policy, through global forums, and through humanitarian foundations. And like an invisible wind, it circles back to the center of the Vatican, where a white pope preaches about climate justice, and a black pope silently sketches the spiritual roadmap for the world to come. We all grew up with textbooks. Each page was a lesson, a timeline, a noble figure, all carefully curated, reviewed, and stamped by official boards of approval. But for that very reason, what is not in the textbook often matters more. Because real history, the deeper, darker, and sometimes more dangerous kind of history, rarely fits within the confines of what is permitted to be taught. And if there is one name that appears only faintly, if at all, in those official textbooks, it is this one, the Jesuits. Despite having held a central and pivotal role in education, politics, and religion for nearly 500 years, the Jesuits are rarely, if ever, explored in any meaningful depth in public school curricula. Why is that? Perhaps it is because their influence is too complex to be easily explained, or perhaps it is because their quiet and pervasive power does not fit neatly into a 45-minute lesson. But the real reason might be much simpler. They do not want students to start asking too many questions. No one ever points out that many of history's most powerful dictators were educated by the Jesuits. No textbook ever explains that global tycoons frequently and generously fund Jesuit institutions. No curriculum ever reveals that global meetings on finance, on technology, and on religion still quietly involve Jesuit observers or advisors. Textbooks do not mention that during the colonial era, the Jesuits acted as crucial bridges between the European courts and the native civilizations, not just through the medium of faith, but through the provision of intelligence, of maps, and, at times, through strategic negotiations. They did not just preach, they reported, they analyzed, and they remembered. No one ever tells you that many of the conspiracy theories that swirl around the Vatican, the ones involving its banks, its post-war migration networks, and its control of the media, often feature at least one prominent figure with a Jesuit education. They do not need to hold a high public office. They just need to be in the room at the right moment. We study the world wars in school, but we rarely hear about the role of Jesuit priests in the resistance movements, or in the post-war reconstruction efforts, or in the protection of the secret escape networks that were tied to Nazi Germany, the ones that people now refer to as Operation Paperclip or the Ratlins. Mainstream history praises scientific progress as a great triumph of modern reason, but it conveniently forgets to mention that many of the world's most influential thinkers, physicists, and philosophers, from Descartes to Teilhard to Chardin, were profoundly shaped by Jesuit thought. This means that they did not just think scientifically, They thought within a deeper metaphysical framework, one that today's students are never taught to recognize. The truth is that these ideas can be taught. But once they are, students might start asking who it is that writes the textbooks, who decides which chapters are included, who approves which knowledge becomes official, and which truths are deliberately silenced. And those are the very questions that the systems in place do not want students to ask. We are taught to remember Galileo as a symbol of the conflict between science and the church. But few of us are ever told that it was Jesuit scholars who initially protected him, that the priests who worked in the Vatican observatories were not the ignorant men that we often imagine them to be, and that the clash between religion and science was far more complicated than we have been led to believe. Because, as one old Jesuit manuscript once put it, knowledge without direction can become a double-edged sword. But when it is properly guided, it becomes the greatest tool for shaping the world. And so, you see, it is what is not in the textbook that is often the most important thing to read. From the Middle Ages all the way to the modern era, religion has always worn two faces. One of them is sacred and is turned towards God, and the other is secular and is turned towards power. And when an institution comes to represent both faith and the control of information, of wealth, of people, and of strategy, one must ask the question, where is the line between belief and power? And who is watching that line? For the Jesuits, a group that has been expelled from more than 80 countries, and yet has still managed to survive, to grow, and to embed itself ever deeper within the global power structures, that question becomes even sharper. They preach humility, yet they operate like a superpower. They pray on a daily basis, yet they oversee dozens of elite universities, hundreds of research centers, and an unofficial intelligence network that spans 4 continents. We are taught to think of religion as a refuge for the soul. But when a religion comes to control human data, to shape minds, to influence public policy, and to command a vast store of multidisciplinary knowledge, it no longer merely saves, it actively shapes history. And that is where the line begins to blur. When a superior general can influence universities all around the world, from Georgetown in the United States to Sophia in Japan to Cumulus in Spain, and when those same institutions go on to produce future presidents, government ministers, and CEOs, is that mission work, or is it strategy? When Jesuit priests sit on advisory boards at the United Nations, discussing humanitarian issues, climate change, education, and environmental policy, are they serving God, or are they becoming the moral directors of the entire planet? And when the Jesuits do not hold any public office, but they still advise the Vatican, world governments, and even transnational financial corporations, what kind of power is it that is really shaping the world? Few people know this, but the traditional Jesuit oath includes a vow of absolute obedience to the Pope, even in unclear matters. And yet, paradoxically, no religious order has ever clashed more frequently with the Vatican than the Jesuits. They were dissolved by the Pope in 1773, only to be fully restored in 1814. And each time they have returned, they have come back even stronger. This raises a deeper and more profound question. Can faith remain pure when it becomes a tool that is used to sustain influence? And can power remain sacred when it relies on silent and completely unchecked networks? The Jesuits are not demons, but they are not mere angels either. They are a global order that is built on belief, that is trained through intellect, and that is run like a sophisticated and highly efficient strategic machine. And in an age where power is scattered across the domains of technology, religion, finance, artificial intelligence, and emerging new ideologies, the Jesuits sit at the crossroads of them all. The question is no longer whether or not they have power. The question is who controls that power, and more importantly, can anyone? When an organization bears both the cross and the compass of influence, the line between faith and dominion is no longer a straight path, but a labyrinth. And inside that labyrinth, much of the world walks forward completely unaware of who it is that is leading them. Every empire has its king. Every religion has its high priest. Every system has its architect. But in today's world, where religion, finance, technology, and academia are all melting together to form a new kind of power, one final question becomes more terrifying than ever before. Who truly rules? We see presidents, CEOs, and religious leaders on our screens every day. But are they really at the center of power? Or are they just the public faces, the front men for something that is much deeper, much older, and far more silent? Deep within the Vatican, there are doors that are not meant for the public to ever see. High atop the academic world, there are theories that are never spoken aloud. And in the very heart of the modern age, where data, belief, and even dreams are being manipulated on a daily basis, a quiet question keeps echoing. Do we really know who it is that decides? In tracing the long and complex story of the Jesuits, from their harsh and binding oaths and their hidden influence to their periods of exile, their remarkable resurgence, and their establishment of a vast network of education and politics, one fundamental truth has become undeniably clear. They never disappeared. They simply adapted. They hid in plain sight. And sometimes they stood at the very center of it all without ever signing their names. They have been called God's soldiers, but perhaps they are more accurately described as the quiet architects of a world that no one dares to name. Not through war, not through violence, but with thought, with structure, and with the power to convince an entire generation of leaders that they are fighting for justice without ever prompting them to ask who it is that defines that justice. The Black Pope, an unofficial title, absent from any religious constitution, and yet spoken with a kind of hushed reverence. No one elects him in a democratic vote, and yet his influence reaches far beyond that of many heads of state. When a man needs no public presence, no political campaign, no social media account, and yet can still shape the direction of global education, of media ethics, and of humanitarian policy, then perhaps he is the one who holds the true power. You may live your entire life without ever hearing his name. But if you have ever studied in a Jesuit school, if you have ever been shaped by Catholic social teaching, or if you have ever believed in a vision of a just and ideal world, then perhaps you have already heard his whisper. It is not a voice that declares, "I rule," but one that gently and persistently asks, "Are you sure that you are the one who is choosing?" In a world that is full of data, but is starved of truth, that is full of faith, but is lacking in genuine guides, the answer no longer seems to matter. Only the question remains, quiet, persistent, and never printed in any textbook. Who truly rules the world that we live in? And even more hauntingly, when did our faith become their tool? This is the end of our journey into the many mysteries that surround the Jesuits, the Vatican, and the invisible throne that sits in the shadows, a place that has no crown, and yet possesses the power to rewrite history without spilling a single drop of blood. If you have found this journey to be thought-provoking, and if you wish to continue exploring the hidden layers of history, the untold mysteries, and the stories that were never meant to be heard, then do not forget to subscribe. It is a small action, but is the key that will unlock deeper, farther, and sometimes more dangerous stories.